Okay, so let's talk about the flowering plants. The flowering plants are the most diverse and abundant group of land plants on the planet. So there's a bunch of them and there's tons of species. And they evolve in the Mesozoic era, during the time of the dinosaurs, essentially. And basically what a flower is, it's a specialized shoot, meaning a stem with different kinds of leaves on it that produce reproductive structures, just like how ferns have reproductive structures on their leaves, okay? And the parts are listed here. Some flowers, not all, have sepals, which are usually green and enclose the flower before it opens. So if you're drawing a flower, here's the stalk. So your sepals are that outer layer here, sepal. Okay. Then of course you have your petals, which in many flowers are brightly colored to attract pollinators, but not all flowers. So there's your petals. Then you have stamens, which are organs that produce pollen. So I'll draw those in purple. So we have stamens up here that produce pollen. And then in the middle, you have the carpel. Carpels are structures that make ovules, okay? That looks awesome. Anyway, so those are the parts of a flower. So let's look at it in a more artistic rendering. So here we have the sepals, the petals, the stamens. This is where pollen is made. Pollen is made in here, pollen. This is the carpel, C-A-R-P-E-L, carpel. And the carpel consists of some important parts, which my text is messed up here, so I'll label these. The carpel consists of the stigma. So when pollen lands or is deposited on the stigma, that's called pollination. The style is the stalk here, leading up to the stigma, and the swollen base down here is the ovary. It's very important that you know that. Ovary. And inside the ovary, this is where students get confused, these two words. Inside the ovary are the ovules. Ovules, remember, these are going to become seeds. Seeds. Inside the ovule is where the egg is. Don't confuse the word ovule for egg. Eggs are inside the ovule. The ovule will become an entire seed. The ovary will become the fruit once all of these eggs are fertilized and these ovules become seeds. Okay? So what happens is that a pollen grain would land up here or be deposited by a bee, and then the pollen tube grows all the way down the stigma, down the style, into the ovary, to one of these ovules, and then it deposits the sperm into that ovule where it can fertilize the egg. Now something really important happens in flowering plants that does not happen in the gymnosperms. Let me just do a little drawing over here. So I'm going to draw an ovule. I'm going to draw the ovule of a flowering plant, and I'm just going to focus on the gametophyte inside. The female gametophyte inside of a flowering plant is only a couple cells big. And there's only two cells that we're going to learn. One of them is the egg. And the other one is this great big cell with two nuclei in it called the central cell. So this cell, this structure is inside an ovule. So those sperm, there's two sperm that come down the pollen grain. Okay? Or the pollen tube, and they come in here. One of them fertilizes the egg. That becomes the embryo. One of them fertilizes the central cell, which is already N plus N, and then a sperm comes in and fertilizes that, and this becomes a triploid tissue. N plus N plus N fused together to be 3N. So once you have a flowering plant seed, you have a 3N tissue, you have an embryo. I'm just going to draw, like a crude plant here. This is going to be your embryo, your diploid embryo. And it's surrounded by triploid 3N endosperm. Endosperm is this tissue that develops when a sperm fertilizes this cell in the middle, and it grows into a tissue called endosperm, which is food for the embryo. And this process where both sperm are used is called double fertilization. Double fertilization, and that's found in the flowering plants only. And endosperm is really important. It's food for the embryo, but it's also what we make flour out of. It's very nutritious. That's why we grow wheat and things like that. It's the food. A lot of the food you get when you eat like a bean or any kind of seed is that endosperm, which is usually some kind of starch or stored sugars of some kind inside of that seed. So seed plants have lots of advantages, and they quickly colonize the world. And by 400 or 300 and some million years ago, there were forests forming of tall plants, that a lot of them being seed plants, and eventually seed plants kind of took over as the dominant plant in the world. Then flowering plants became the most dominant kind of seed plant. But seed plants have secondary growth, meaning they produce wood. They can get tall and big and dominate the landscape, and they can get their seeds and pollen out long distances because of that. They no longer need water to get sperm to the egg, so they can get away from standing water. The egg is inside of a protective structure, so that developing embryo is inside of a protective structure. And the seeds contain food for that developing embryo, so that when that seed falls off, you have a baby inside of a sealed protective capsule along with food, so that baby can lay in the dirt for a year or two even before it starts to grow, and it'll be okay. So seeds are this amazing packet and seeds can be eaten by animals and then pooped out miles away and spread by animals. So there's tons of opportunities for seed plants to spread themselves around. And just to show you here, here's a bunch of flowers and fruits and things from the Cretaceous fossil site that I worked on for my master's degree. So here's a fossil flower. Here's a bunch of different kinds of fruit. So even by the end of the Cretaceous, there were tons of flowering plants just exploding in diversity. Tons of these things. And only, actually, none of these, well, one of these species has been published. All of these are unnamed species that still need to be worked on. Okay, so just to remind you, seed plants seem confusing at first, but their structures are homologous to the other plants we saw. So on this side, homology, this is gametophytes. There's a female gametophyte. There's a male gametophyte in seed plants. These are homologous to the gametophytes of ferns and mosses that we see here. Pollen grains, are male gametophytes. Here's that gametophyte of a seed plant. We focused on the egg and the central cell, which is this big cell in the middle. That becomes the endosperm when fertilized. Sporophytes in mosses is just this little stalk. In conifers and in ferns and in flowering plants, it's the big plant that you see is the sporophyte. Okay, so these things are all diploid on this side. They make spores. All the things you see on this side are haploid. They make gametes. So pollen grains make sperm. Female gametophytes inside the ovule make an egg, right? So remember, gametophytes make gametes, sporophytes make spores. Spores grow into pollen grains in the seed plants. But in the seedless plants, pollen grains grow into a gametophyte that makes sperm. Okay, and then to wrap up this chapter, let's just mention flowering plants and the fact that they've co-evolved with pollinators. So remember, pollination is when pollen goes from one plant to another. Fertilization is when sperm meets egg. So do not confuse those two terms. Here's a beetle covered in pollen, eating pollen from one plant, then it'll go to another, and it will transfer pollen to the stigma of another plant. Here is a plant pollinated by flies. This plant looks like meat, and it smells like death. It smells like rotten meat. Flies come to it, spread pollen around. Bees, of course, are a huge pollinator, very important pollinator. You can see this one covered in pollen. They go from flower to flower. Flowers give them nectar. Bees transfer the pollen. It's a mutual relationship. Both benefit from that relationship. But some plants use wind pollination, even flowering plants. So think about it. If you're a flowering plant, you don't care about how you smell. You don't care about how you look. But you are going to have great big long stamens to have lots of stamens out in the air, and the stigma is going to have tons of surface area so it can capture that pollen. And wind pollination is going to be common in environments like Arkansas. Oak trees are wind pollinated, but they won't be common in places without any wind, like the middle of a jungle. So you'll see wind pollinated plants in certain parts of the world. They're the ones that cause most of our allergies. So here is like a hazelnut tree or something like that, and these are male flowers, and look how ugly they are. They're not pretty. Why not? They don't need to attract pollinators. They don't care. They use the wind to spread their pollen. So most people wouldn't even recognize these as flowers, but they are. Here's corn. The tassels on a corn plant here, those are the female stigmas that capture the pollen from the male part of the plant. There's the male flowers on top. Not very pretty. Why not? They don't care. They don't need to attract pollinators. The last part of the chapter, I just want to touch on this just so we've covered it. The last thing is a cool mutualistic organism. So we talk about the word symbiosis. That's when two organisms live close to one another or interact with each other. And there's different kinds of symbioses. The important one here is mutualism. Just like we see with plants and fungus, mutualism is when both benefit from the relationship. And here we see a mutualistic relationship between fungus and, in this case, algae or sometimes cyanobacteria, some kind of photosynthetic organism. And the photosynthetic organism makes sugars. The fungus provides a moist environment for those organisms to live in. And we call this relationship lichens. And you'll see lichens all over campus growing on trees and on rocks. And in fact, it's two different species living in a mutualistic relationship tightly close together. The fungus provides habitat for the algae. The algae provides food to the fungus. Isn't that cool? Anyway, these organisms are all over the place and often ignored as well. So now you've had a walk through some of these early organisms that colonize the world and are very dominant today still in the world, providing us with oxygen and more importantly, flowering plants provide a lot of oxygen, but more importantly, they provide us with the basis of our food chain. So we're going to pick up with animal diversity next.